The commander's skull cracked against reinforced steel with a sound like thunder in a tin can, and in the silence that followed, Station Warden Keth'ra realized that gravity had never been her friend. Captain Mara Chen drifted in the center of the zero-gravity isolation cell, her dark hair spreading around her face like ink in water, her expression calm as stone. Blood droplets from the commander's broken nose hung suspended in the air between them, tiny crimson spheres catching the harsh overhead light. Keth'ra's secondary arms trembled as she gripped the viewport frame, her compound eyes tracking the slow rotation of Commander Vaultek's unconscious body as it tumbled toward the far corner of the cell. The human had barely moved. One push. One calculated, brutal push that had turned their most secure detention measure into a killing box. Mara's voice came soft through the intercom, almost gentle. I warned him not to come in here alone. 27 hours earlier, the S-Nomad had limped into Relay Station Tertius 9 trailing debris and distress signals. Mara had brought her crew through the docking clamps with practiced efficiency, her ship's hull scarred from what she'd reported as a pirate encounter in the Veiled Reaches. Keth'ra had processed the docking request personally, noting the captain's calm demeanor even as her engineer reported critical life support failures, and her navigator nursed a broken arm. The Nomad was a mid-range cargo hauler, nothing impressive, registered out of Luna Station with a clean record spanning 8 years. Mara Chen's file showed 15 successful long-haul runs, 3 commendations for aid rendered to stranded vessels, and exactly 0 disciplinary incidents. The file had not mentioned what Mara could do in zero gravity. Station Tertius 9 served as a waypoint between the inner colonies and the frontier territories, a rotating cylinder of commerce and neutral ground maintained by the Galactic Collective. Keth'ra had overseen security here for 9 years, long enough to recognize when a ship's damage told a different story than its captain's report. The scorch marks along the Nomad's port side were wrong, too precise, too clean. When she'd suggested holding the ship for a formal inspection, Mara had simply nodded and asked if her crew could grab a hot meal while they waited. Commander Vaultek had arrived 6 hours later, his enforcement cruiser dropping out of warp with the kind of aggressive deceleration that made docking supervisors wince. The Collective's anti-piracy task force had been tracking a human-operated vessel matching the Nomad's profile, suspected of smuggling restricted technology through neutral space. Vaultek's species, the Keth'ra, had evolved on a heavy-gravity world where strength meant survival and patience meant death. He'd stormed onto the station with 4 armed deputies, his scales gleaming midnight blue under the corridor lights, and demanded immediate access to the impounded ship. Keth'ra had tried to explain proper protocols. Vaultek had threatened to file a formal complaint about obstruction of justice. His voice had carried through the security office like a rockslide, all growling consonants and barely contained fury. Mara, sitting in the adjacent waiting area with a cup of station coffee and a datapad showing her crew's repair estimates, had looked up once and then returned to her reading. The inspection had taken 3 hours. Vaultek's team had torn through the Nomad's cargo holds with methodical brutality, scanning every container, checking every manifest entry against the Collective's restricted technology database. They'd found agricultural equipment bound for the colony on Kepler 442b, medical supplies destined for the research outpost at Wolf 1061c, replacement parts for atmospheric processors. Everything properly documented, everything within legal parameters, everything too clean. Keth'ra had watched from the security feed as Vaultek's frustration mounted. The commander had pulled Mara aside in the cargo bay, his bulk towering over her slight frame, and begun asking questions in that particular tone enforcement officers used when they already believed you guilty. Where had she really been in the Veiled Reaches? What kind of pirates used precision weapons? Why had her ship's computer logs been reformatted 3 days ago? Mara had answered each question with the same calm clarity she'd shown since docking. Equipment malfunction during the attack. Standard security wipe after a potential breach. Nothing to hide, just trying to get her ship fixed and her crew home. Vault-Tec had arrested her anyway. The charges were vague, built on suspicion rather than evidence. Possible smuggling, obstruction of investigation, operating with falsified credentials. Keth'ra had processed the detention order with growing unease, noting how Vault-Tec's jaw plates flexed with satisfaction as the security team escorted Mara to holding. The human had walked between her guards without resistance, her hands loosely restrained, her expression showing nothing but mild curiosity about her surroundings. The zero-gravity isolation cell occupied the station's central axis, where rotation hadn't yet imparted spin gravity. Tertius 9 used it for violent offenders, species whose physiology made them dangerous in standard detention. The theory was simple: remove the advantage of leverage, of being able to brace and strike. Turn three-dimensional space into a disorienting void where every movement sent you tumbling. Keth'ra had questioned the placement. Mara Chen had shown no signs of violence, no indication she'd resist arrest. Vault-Tec had overruled her with a gesture of his primary clause. Humans were deathworlders, he'd reminded her. They came from a planet where everything tried to kill them, where gravity crushed lesser species, and the atmosphere burned with reactive oxygen. They couldn't be trusted in standard holding where they might overpower guards or damage station infrastructure. Mara had floated into the cell without comment, her restraints removed once the airlock sealed. She'd oriented herself with a single touch against the wall, then tucked into a loose ball and remained there for the first 8 hours, apparently sleeping while she drifted in slow circles through the empty space. Keth'ra had checked the feeds regularly, part of her security routine. The cell measured 10 meters on each side, its walls padded against impact, its atmosphere maintained at standard collective parameters. Monitoring equipment tracked heart rate, respiration, neural activity. Mara's readings showed steady, almost meditative calm. She woke periodically to drink from the water dispenser mounted on one wall, used the waste facilities with practiced efficiency, then returned to her floating rest. The crew of the Nomad had filed formal complaints. Mara's engineer, a stocky woman named Rodriguez with forearms like bridge cables, had appeared at Keth'ra's office demanding to see her captain. The navigator, a soft-spoken man called Yuki whose broken arm now wore a medical brace, had brought documentation proving their cargo's legitimacy. Even the ship's AI had submitted a 14-page brief outlining the legal violations in Vault-Tec's arrest order. Vault-Tec had ignored all of it. He'd spent the last 24 hours in communication with his superiors, building his case through implication and circumstantial detail. Keth'ra had watched him work with growing certainty that this wasn't about smuggling or restricted technology. This was about a human captain who'd made him look incompetent, who'd stayed calm when he'd wanted fear, who'd refused to give him the confession he needed. The confrontation had started 3 hours ago. Vault-Tec had entered the observation room adjacent to the isolation cell with a datapad and renewed determination. He'd activated the communication system and begun asking Mara questions about her route through the veiled reaches, about contacts she might have made with independent traders, about technology that might have changed hands in the lawless spaces between stars. Mara had answered from her position in the cell's center, her body loose and relaxed despite 19 hours without gravity. Yes, she'd met independent traders. Yes, some of them operated outside collective jurisdiction. No, she hadn't purchased or transported anything illegal. Her voice had carried the same patient clarity it always did, as if she was explaining basic navigation to a nervous rookie. Vault-Tec's questions had grown sharper. Had she disabled her ship's tracking transponder? Had she used false identification codes? Had she made contact with the resistance cells operating in the frontier territories? Mara had paused at that last question, and something shifted in her expression. What resistance cells? The commander had leaned closer to the viewport, his reflection distorting across the curved surface. Don't pretend ignorance, human. We know your species has been organizing in the outer colonies, building weapons, planning coordinated action against collective authority. I transport cargo, Mara had said quietly. Agricultural equipment, medical supplies, replacement parts. I don't build weapons. You don't need to build them. Vaultek's claws had scraped against the observation room's console. You are weapons. Every human that ventures beyond your home system carries the potential for violence. Your species thrives on conflict, on dominance, on turning every environment into a battlefield. Keth'ra had watched this exchange from the security office, her discomfort crystallizing into something colder. She'd served in the collective long enough to recognize prejudice wearing the mask of protocol. The enforcement codes required evidence, required proof beyond suspicion. Vaultek was building toward something else, toward an admission extracted through pressure and isolation. Mara had been quiet for several seconds before responding. Commander, with respect, you're projecting your own fears onto an entire species based on outdated threat assessments and cultural stereotypes. The words had landed like a physical blow. Vaultek's scales had darkened with rage, the color shift spreading from his neck ridge to his shoulder plates. You dare lecture me about threat assessment? I've studied human history. I've read the reports from your home world. War after war, conflict after conflict, your people spreading across your planet like a plague of violence. And now you bring that same hunger for dominance to the stars. We also bring medicine, Mara had said, her voice still calm. Engineering, art, the capacity to learn and change. You're choosing to see only what confirms what you already believe. Vaultek had slammed his primary hand against the console hard enough to make Keth'ra's screen flicker. Enough philosophy. I'm coming in there. We're going to have a real conversation about what you're hiding. Keth'ra had activated her communicator immediately. Commander, regulations prohibit entering an active isolation cell without proper authorization, which I have. Vaultek had cut the connection before she could finish. She'd watched him exit the observation room and move toward the airlock, her secondary arms already reaching for the emergency protocols. Something about the way Mara had shifted position in the cell, the way her body had oriented toward the approaching airlock, had sent warning signals through Keth'ra's entire nervous system. The airlock had cycled. Vaultek had entered the zero-gravity cell with the confidence of someone who'd trained in null-G environments, using the handholds to control his trajectory. His species' heavy world physiology gave him mass and strength even here, where weight meant nothing. He'd crossed half the distance to Mara before speaking, his voice harsh through the internal speakers. Now then, Captain Chen, let's discuss what really happened in the veiled reaches. Mara had remained motionless, her body in a loose crouch against one wall. I've already told you everything I know. You've told me a story. Vaultek had pushed off from a handhold, closing the distance between them with practiced ease. I want the truth. Who did you meet out there? What technology did they give you? What plans are being made in the frontier territories? There are no plans. Mara's voice had stayed level. There's no conspiracy. You're chasing shadows because you need there to be an enemy. Vaultek had reached for her, his claws extending. I'm giving you one chance to cooperate before. That was when Mara moved. Not away from his grasp, but into it, her hands catching his outstretched arm at the wrist and elbow. She'd used his own momentum, the forward trajectory he'd built crossing the cell, and added to it with a single powerful push from her legs against the wall. Newton's third law took over from there. For every action, an equal and opposite reaction. Vaultek had shot backward across the cell at frightening speed, his mass and velocity combining into devastating force. Mara had twisted as she released him, using his arm like a lever to add rotational energy to his linear motion. The commander had tumbled through empty air, his limbs flailing for purchase that didn't exist, and struck the far wall with his skull leading. The impact had been catastrophic. Reinforced steel met Keth'ra bone at a combined velocity that turned structural integrity into a suggestion. Vault-Tec had bounced once, his body going limp, blood spraying from his nose and mouth in spreading globules. Then he drifted, unconscious and possibly dying, while Mara returned to the cell's center with a gentle push. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 3 seconds. Keth'ra had activated emergency protocols immediately, sealing the cell and calling for medical response. Now she stood at the viewport, watching Mara float in the aftermath, and tried to process what she'd witnessed. The human hadn't attacked. She defended herself using nothing but physics and timing. She turned the commander's aggression into a weapon and his environment into an accomplice. "Medical team is en route," Keth'ra said through the intercom, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "What were you thinking?" Mara looked toward the viewport, her expression showing something like sadness. "I was thinking about momentum and trajectory. About how dangerous it is to grab someone in zero gravity when you're already moving. About basic physics that apparently isn't covered in collective enforcement training. You could have killed him. I could have." Mara's gaze didn't waver. "I calculated the impact force to be survivable for Keth'ra physiology. Painful, likely to cause concussion and possible skull fracture, but survivable. If I'd wanted him dead, I would have aimed for a rotational collision that would have snapped his neck." The casual precision of those words sent cold clarity through Keth'ra's thoughts. This wasn't a cargo captain who'd gotten lucky in a desperate moment. This was someone who understood violence with mathematical accuracy, who'd assessed angles and forces and biological tolerances in the split second before acting. "What are you really?" Keth'ra asked quietly. Mara was silent for a moment, her body rotating slowly in the cell's center. Blood droplets from Vault-Tec's injury had spread throughout the space, creating a constellation of red against the white walls. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight it hadn't held before. "I'm exactly what my file says. A cargo captain, 15 successful runs, 3 commendations, 0 disciplinary incidents. But I'm also the daughter of a woman who taught hand-to-hand combat to Marines, and the granddaughter of a man who flew rescue missions in zero-G construction zones for 40 years. I grew up training in environments most species never experience. This," she gestured at the weightless space around her, "this is familiar territory." The medical team arrived, 2 collective doctors and a security escort. Keth'ra coordinated the extraction, watching as they carefully retrieved Vault-Tec's unconscious form and rushed him toward the station's medical bay. Preliminary scans showed severe concussion, fractured skull plates, and internal bleeding. Survivable, as Mara had calculated, but requiring immediate intervention. Keth'ra returned her attention to the viewport. Mara had moved to one wall and was methodically collecting the suspended blood droplets, using a cleaning cloth from the cell's supply locker. She worked with the same calm efficiency she'd shown since arrival, gathering the biological debris and depositing it in the waste system. "The collective will want answers," Keth'ra said. "This incident will trigger an investigation." "Good." Mara finished cleaning and returned to the cell's center. "Let them investigate. They'll find that Commander Vault-Tec violated protocols by entering an isolation cell alone, that he initiated physical contact against a detained subject, and that I responded with minimum necessary force to defend myself. Station logs will support every word." She was right. Keth'ra had already reviewed the footage 3 times. Vault-Tec's approach, his extended claws, his aggressive posture. Mara's defensive response, calculated and controlled despite its dramatic result. Any neutral arbiter would see self-defense, not assault, but the political fallout would be complex. A human captain had injured a collective enforcement commander using the very containment measure meant to neutralize her advantage. Questions would be asked about human capabilities in zero gravity, about whether standard protocols were adequate for a species that treated weightlessness as familiar terrain. You knew this would happen, Keth'ra said, the realization settling into certainty. You knew he'd come into the cell. You were waiting. Mara met her gaze through the viewport. I knew he'd make a mistake eventually. Men like Vault-Tec always do. They see what they expect to see, not what's actually there. He expected a cargo captain who'd be helpless in zero-G. Instead, he got someone who's been training in null environments since she was 8 years old. Why not tell him? Why not warn him about your capabilities? Would he have listened? Mara's expression showed genuine curiosity. Would knowing I could defend myself have changed his approach, or would it have just confirmed his belief that humans are inherently violent? Sometimes the only way to prove you're not a threat is to demonstrate that you could be one and choose not to. The philosophical complexity of that statement hung in the air between them. Keth'ra thought about her 9 years on Tertius 9, about the thousands of beings who'd passed through her security checkpoints. She'd processed every species in the collective, learned to recognize the subtle differences in threat assessment and behavioral patterns. Humans remained difficult to categorize, their baseline capabilities so far outside standard parameters that normal protocols failed. What happens now? Keth'ra asked. Mara considered the question, her gaze distant. Now you make a choice, Warden. You can file a report that supports Vault-Tec's narrative, that portrays me as a violent smuggler who attacked an enforcement officer. The evidence won't support it, but political pressure might carry the day anyway. Or you can file an accurate report that shows exactly what happened, let the facts stand on their own, and trust the system to reach the right conclusion. The system that arrested you without evidence. The same system that employs you to maintain security fairly and protect detainees from abuse. Mara's voice softened. I've watched you, Warden Keth'ra. You questioned Vault-Tec's protocols. You tried to follow proper procedures. You're not looking for enemies. You're looking for truth. Keth'ra felt the weight of those words settle against her carapace. Her species valued truth above comfort, honored accuracy even when it complicated simple narratives. She'd spent her career building a reputation for fairness precisely because the collective needed security officials who could look beyond prejudice and politics. I'll file an accurate report, she said finally. Whatever consequences follow, they'll be built on facts. Something like relief crossed Mara's face. Thank you. The next several hours brought bureaucratic chaos. Vault-Tec's superiors demanded immediate answers. Mara's crew threatened legal action if their captain wasn't released. The collective's regional administrator opened a formal inquiry. Keth'ra processed it all with methodical precision, documenting every detail, preserving every piece of evidence. The medical bay reported that Vault-Tec had regained consciousness with severe concussion and temporary memory loss. His skull fractures would heal with standard treatment. His internal bleeding had been controlled, and his prognosis was good. The commander's first words upon waking had been a demand to know why Mara Chen wasn't in maximum restraints. Keth'ra had visited him in recovery, her report datapad ready. She'd shown him the footage of his unauthorized cell entry, his aggressive approach, Mara's defensive response. She'd included force calculations prepared by the station's physicist, demonstrating how the commander's own momentum had contributed 90% of the impact energy. Vault-Tec had watched in silence, his scales pale with medication and shock. When the footage ended, he'd turned away from Keth'ra and said nothing. The collective's investigation took 16 hours. 3 neutral arbiters reviewed the evidence, interviewed witnesses, examined medical reports. They concluded what Keth'ra had known from the beginning. Mara Chen had acted in lawful self-defense against an enforcement officer who'd violated multiple protocols. The smuggling charges were dismissed for lack of evidence. Vaultek received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining in detention procedures. Mara was released from the isolation cell with full apology and compensation for wrongful detention. Keth'ra met her at the airlock as she exited, watching the human adjust to spin gravity with subtle shifts in posture and balance. Mara's crew waited in the corridor beyond, Rodriguez and Yuki and 3 others whose relief was palpable. "Your ship has been cleared for departure," Keth'ra said, offering the release documentation. "Repairs are complete, courtesy of station services as part of your compensation package." Mara accepted the datapad, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Warden, for following the evidence. It's my job." Keth'ra paused, then added more quietly, "Though I suspect this incident will complicate human collective relations." "Maybe." Mara glanced toward the viewport showing the station's central axis, where the isolation cell remained visible in the distance. "Or maybe it'll remind people that environment matters, that assumptions about capability need to account for context and training. Zero gravity isn't a cage for everyone. For some of us, it's home territory." She walked toward her crew, accepting their embrace with the same quiet competence she'd shown throughout her detention. Rodriguez said something that made her smile. Yuki checked her over for injuries with careful attention. They moved together toward the docking bay, a unit that had weathered crisis through mutual trust. Keth'ra watched them go, then returned to her office. She had reports to file, statements to compile, recommendations to make about protocol updates. But first she pulled up the footage one more time, watching the 3-second sequence where Mara Chen had turned physics into poetry. The push had been perfect. Not excessive, not theatrical, just precisely calculated force applied at exactly the right angle to achieve the necessary result. It was the kind of movement that came from thousands of hours of practice, from understanding your environment so completely that reaction became instinct. Keth'ra thought about her own species' evolution on a world where information mattered more than strength, where compound eyes that could process multiple data streams simultaneously meant survival. Every species brought its home world into space with it. Humans brought gravity, or rather the ability to thrive in its absence. She began drafting her recommendations. Update detention protocols for Deathworlder species. Require minimum 2-person teams for isolation cell entry. Implement mandatory null-G training for enforcement personnel working in zero-gravity environments. Basic physics review for all security staff. The recommendations felt inadequate, like trying to contain an ocean with updated bucket specifications. The truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. The collective had grown complacent in its assumptions about human limitations. They'd seen Earth's crushing gravity and assumed humans needed weight to function. They'd missed the adaptability, the training, the generational knowledge that turned every environment into familiar territory. Mara Chen wasn't an exception. She was a demonstration of what humans could do when they stopped accepting other species' assumptions about their capabilities. 3 hours later, the S-Nomad departed Tertius 9 with full clearance and an amended service record showing exemplary cooperation with station authorities. Keth'ra tracked the ship's departure on her monitors, watching it accelerate toward the outer system and the jump point beyond. Rodriguez had filed a brief addendum to their departure log, a note thanking station security for professional conduct and expressing hope for continued positive relations. Yuki had included a recipe for something called green tea ice cream, described as a human delicacy best enjoyed in zero-G. Even the ship's AI had submitted a formal commendation for Warden Keth'ra's adherence to evidence-based protocols. Mara's contribution was simpler. A single line added to the guest log. Gravity is a habit, not a requirement. Remember that before you cage something you don't understand. Keth'ra read those words multiple times, parsing their layers. Warning, wisdom, and gentle reminder all compressed into 15 words. She thought about Vaultek's assumptions, about her own initial uncertainty, about the way easy categorization created dangerous blind spots. Her communicator chimed. The regional administrator wanted a conference about policy updates. The medical bay reported Vaultek's full recovery and scheduled release. 3 new ships had entered the docking queue, their manifests waiting for security review. Keth'ra returned her attention to her duties, processing each task with the methodical precision her species had perfected. But part of her awareness remained on that footage, on those 3 seconds, where a human captain had demonstrated that the cage was never about containing violence. It was about confronting fear. 2 weeks later, a cargo manifest crossed Keth'ra's desk showing the Nomad scheduled for return to Tertius 9 in 37 days. Agricultural equipment bound for Kepler 442b, medical supplies for Wolf 1061c, replacement parts for atmospheric processors, everything properly documented, everything within legal parameters. Keth'ra approved the docking request and added a personal note to the file. "Welcome back, Captain Chen. Coffee is on me this time." She submitted her updated protocols to the collective the same day. The recommendations included mandatory physics review, enhanced training requirements, and a new section addressing environmental advantages for species evolved in varying gravity conditions. The bureaucratic machinery would grind through the proposal slowly, but Keth'ra had learned patience in her 9 years on station. Some changes happened in sudden, violent moments. Others accumulated through quiet persistence, through accurate reports and documented evidence, through the slow work of replacing fear with understanding. The isolation cell remained empty, its padded walls showing scorch marks from emergency cleaning. Keth'ra filed a maintenance request to have the blood stains removed, then paused and amended it. "Leave them," she wrote. "They serve as a reminder that every security measure carries assumptions about who it's meant to contain. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is assume you understand someone's limitations. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong about what made them dangerous in the first place." The stars turned beyond the viewport, distant and indifferent. Somewhere in that vast darkness, the Nomad pushed toward the frontier territories, carrying its cargo and its crew and its captain who understood that home wasn't a place defined by gravity. It was a place defined by choice, by the people who stood beside you when the weight fell away, and all that remained was momentum and trust. Keth'ra finished her report and leaned back in her chair, her compound eyes processing the multiple data streams of station operations. Ships coming and going, beings of 1,000 species passing through neutral space, the endless work of maintaining order in the spaces between worlds. And in the central axis, where spin hadn't yet imparted weight, an empty cell waited with walls that had learned the difference between cage and weapon. It was a lesson worth remembering. 3 months later, the policy updates were approved. 6 months after that, enforcement training included mandatory null-G certification. A year later, Keth'ra was promoted to Regional Security Coordinator based on her comprehensive review of detention protocols. She never forgot the 3 seconds that changed everything. The push, the calculation, the demonstration that understanding someone's capabilities meant first questioning your own assumptions about their limitations. Sometimes the best security measure wasn't a stronger cage. It was the wisdom to know when you were building one for the wrong reasons.